My father built his empire with a surveyor's level and a stubborn refusal to die poor. And his widow started dismantling it before the flowers on his casket had even wilted. My name is Nathaniel Whitfield. I'm 35 years old. I live in Phoenix, Arizona. And for most of my adult life, I believed that family was something sacred, something that didn't need a contract, something you could trust. I was wrong. And the education that corrected me cost me 48 hours of grief, 3 weeks of strategic silence, and one courtroom moment that I will remember for the rest of my life. Let me take you back to the beginning. My father, Walter Whitfield, built Whitfield General Contractors from nothing. I mean nothing. He started with a used pickup truck, a personal loan of $12,000 from my grandfather, and a commercial construction license he had studied for while working night shifts as a framing carpenter. By the time I was born in 1989, he had 4 employees. By the time I was in middle school, he had 42. By the time I graduated from Arizona State University in 2011 with a degree in civil engineering, Whitfield General Contractors was a mid-sized commercial construction firm headquartered in North Phoenix, pulling in contracts across Maricopa and Pinal counties. The company had a fleet of equipment, 2 yards, a solid reputation for government bids, and a workforce of nearly 110 people. My dad was not a showy man. He drove the same Ford F-250 for 12 years. He wore Wranglers and work boots to business meetings and didn't apologize for it. He called a bluff when he saw one, shook hands like he meant it, and slept 8 hours every single night because, as he always said, a man who's tired makes bad decisions. He was also, unfortunately, a man who fell in love twice. My mother, Diane Whitfield, passed away from a brain aneurysm in January 2003. I was 13 years old. My dad was devastated in the quiet way strong men are. He didn't cry in front of me, but I could hear him in the kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning, sitting alone. The radio turned so low it was barely a whisper. He carried his grief in his chest like a load-bearing wall, invisible but structural. He met Renee Castellano in 2007. She was 31 years old at the time, 29 years younger than my dad, a fact that nobody in the family said out loud, but everyone mentally noted. She was sharp-looking, well-spoken, recently out of a short first marriage, and working as an office manager at a commercial real estate brokerage in Scottsdale. She was friendly in the calculated way that some people are, warm enough to be likable, careful enough never to let you fully in. My dad was 60 years old that year, recently retired from the field and lonely in the way that men his generation never quite know how to name. They married in 2009. Renee became Renee Whitfield. She was 33. My father was 62. I was 20 years old and already enrolled at ASU, watching the whole thing from a careful, polite distance. I tried to like her. I genuinely did. She was never openly cruel to me. She was something harder to name. She was cordially indifferent. She treated me the way a hotel concierge treats a long-term guest, professionally, predictably, and with zero actual interest in who I was. Every conversation had an invisible boundary. Every holiday had a slight tension underneath the pleasantries. Every time I came home for a weekend, Renee would find a reason to be somewhere else for the first few hours, then arrive back just in time to make it look like she'd been there the whole time. My dad never saw it. Or maybe he did, and he just loved her too much to say. I've spent a long time trying to figure out which one it was. What I know for certain is that by 2019, when I had been working as a project manager at Whitfield General for 6 years and my father had started taking half days on Fridays, Renee had quietly and systematically made herself indispensable to the business, not in any engineering or project capacity. She had no background in construction, but she had positioned herself as the company's office director, managing payroll administration, vendor relationships, and accounts receivable. She had a salary. She had a company card. She had a desk in the office 3 days a week. And my dad bragged to his friends that she had really stepped up. I noticed things. Small things. A vendor invoice that seemed inflated. A payroll line item with a name I didn't recognize. Mileage reimbursements for routes that didn't match any job sites. I mentioned it once to my father in October 2021, carefully, professionally framing it as a financial audit question and not as an accusation against his wife. He looked at me across his kitchen table with tired eyes and said, "Nathaniel, I'm 64 years old. I'm not going to spend whatever time I've got left auditing my own marriage. I dropped it. I shouldn't have." My father was diagnosed with a progressive cardiac condition in early 2022. arrhythmia compounded by arterial blockage that his cardiologist at Desert Cross Medical Center described as a ticking clock that couldn't be wound back. He had surgery. He recovered. He slowed down even more. He talked about retirement constantly and did it never. He passed away on a Tuesday morning in March 2024. He was 67 years old. He died at home in bed with Renee beside him. I got the phone call at 6:47 a.m. and I drove from my house in Tempe to the family home in North Phoenix in under 20 minutes, which tells you something about how fast I was driving. He looked peaceful. That part is true. Whatever you believe about where people go, my father looked like a man who had finally put down a very heavy thing and was resting. I stood in his bedroom for a long time. Renee was in the kitchen on the phone with the funeral home, her voice low and efficient. Businesslike. I noted that, filed it away, and told myself I was being uncharitable because I was grieving. The funeral was held the following Friday. Family, employees, subcontractors, city officials who knew my dad. The place was packed. Men in work boots and women in black dresses, all pressed together in the same pew, all holding the same stunned, quiet grief for a man who had built things that would outlast everyone in that room. Renee sat in the front row. She cried at the appropriate moments. She thanked people graciously during the reception. She was, as always, the picture of composure. 48 hours after my father's funeral, on Sunday morning, I received an email. It was from a family law and estate attorney based in Scottsdale, a man named Philip Wren, informing me that he was acting on behalf of Renee Whitfield, and that pursuant to my father's most recently executed will, dated November 2023, Mrs. Whitfield was the sole beneficiary of the estate, including the family residence, all financial accounts held jointly or individually by Mr. Walter Whitfield, and 100% of the shares in Whitfield General Contractors, LLC. The email requested that I contact Mr. Wren's office within 5 business days to discuss the orderly transition of any items of personal property I wish to retrieve from the family residence. In other words, your father is buried. Get your stuff and get out. I sat at my kitchen table in Tempe and read that email 4 times. I want to tell you that I got angry. A part of me did. A hot electrical flash of it that lasted about 30 seconds. But then something else happened. Something colder and more deliberate settled into my chest. And I recognized it immediately because I had felt it before on job sites. When a subcontractor tried to cut corners on a structural detail and I had to decide in the next 15 seconds how I was going to handle it. I felt the anger go quiet. I felt my brain shift into gear. I didn't know it yet, but my father had prepared me for exactly this moment in a way Renee never anticipated. I poured a cup of coffee. I sat back down and I called my attorney. His name is Andrew Kessler. He's 49 years old, a business and estate litigation attorney based in downtown Phoenix with 23 years of experience and a reputation that most people in commercial construction in the Valley are aware of if they've been around long enough. Andrew and my father had worked together for over a decade on everything from corporate structuring to contractor disputes. Andrew had also, as it happened, drafted and overseen the execution of my father's will. Not the November 2023 will that Philip Wren was referencing. A different one. Andrew picked up on the second ring. "Nathaniel, I was expecting your call. Are you okay? I'm functional. Tell me what you know about a will dated November 2023. A pause. A long one. Nathaniel, before you do anything, I need you to come into the office tomorrow morning. There are things I need to show you in person." I didn't push him. I didn't sleep much that night either. The next morning, Monday, I walked into Andrew's office on North Central Avenue at 8:30. He was already at his desk, a stack of documents in front of him and 2 cups of coffee waiting. He didn't waste any time. "Your father came to see me in September 2023, Andrew said. He was concerned. He had started noticing things in the business accounts, discrepancies he couldn't explain. He asked me to help him restructure. There it was. He came to you before he came to me. He didn't want to alarm you. He also didn't have proof yet, just instincts. Your dad was smart, Nathaniel. He trusted his instincts." What my father had done. Quietly, systematically, and with Andrew's help. Over the course of 6 weeks in the fall of 2023, was restructure Whitfield General Contractors in a way that was entirely legal, entirely thorough, and entirely invisible to Renee. He had converted his sole ownership stake in Whitfield General Contractors, LLC, into a structure involving a family trust, the Walter H. Whitfield Family Trust, and a separate holding entity. The trust had a designated trustee and a designated beneficiary for operational control of the business assets. The trustee was Andrew Kessler. The beneficiary for business succession and operational control was Nathaniel Allen Whitfield. Me. The November 2023 will that Renee's attorney was waving around. It was real. It was valid. It had been executed by my father. And it left Renee the family residence, the personal financial accounts, which were substantial, and 100% of something called Whitfield General Contractors LLC, which, as of the trust restructuring completed in October 2023, held no assets. No equipment, no contracts, no employees, no receivables, no real property. The LLC was a clean, empty shell. Everything of actual value. The equipment fleet, the 2 yards, the active contracts, the company's operational accounts, the goodwill, the licenses, the workforce, had been legally transferred into the holding entity controlled by the trust 2 months before my father wrote that will. Renee's attorney had sent me an email informing me I had 5 business days to collect my personal belongings. He was about to discover that his client had inherited the name of a company and a debt-free, zero-asset corporate shell worth approximately nothing. I didn't know yet exactly when Renee would figure it out, but I knew it was going to be a very specific moment, and I intended to be there for it. Andrew looked at me across his desk. She's going to fight this. Philip Wren is competent, and he will argue that the restructuring was fraudulent, that your father intentionally divested assets from the estate to defeat Renee's spousal inheritance rights. Can he win? Not easily. The restructuring is clean. Your father had documented business reasons, the discrepancies he found in the accounts. We have an audit trail, and Arizona law gives a surviving spouse an elective share of the augmented estate. But the timing and the documentation are going to make that argument very difficult for them. Andrew leaned forward. But here's what I'm recommending, Nathaniel. Don't fight it in a way that looks like a fight. Do the opposite. I looked at him. Say more. He smiled, a dry, careful litigation veteran smile. Agree to everything. Give Renee exactly what the November will says. The house, the personal accounts, the LLC. I sat with that for a moment. And then let Philip Wren open the LLC's books. I drove, home that evening. I sat on my back patio with a beer and watched the sun go down behind the South Mountain Range, painting the sky in shades of orange and copper. Phoenix is brutal in the summer, but the sunsets are honest. They don't soften anything. They just burn beautifully. I thought about my dad driving that old F-250, eating the same diner breakfast every Thursday morning, trusting his instincts all the way to the end. I've got it from here, Dad, I said out loud to no one. Renee sent me a text 3 days after the funeral. That's how I know the grief was at least partly curated. 3 days of widow's silence, and then a text message from a woman who had never texted me anything warmer than a grocery list. Nathaniel, I'd appreciate it if we could handle this like adults. Philip will be in touch. Handle this like adults. I read it twice, then set my phone face down on the counter and started making breakfast. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, black coffee. Exactly what my father used to make every Saturday morning at the house in North Phoenix. I had learned to cook it the way he did. No butter in the eggs, just heat and patience, and I hadn't been able to stop making it since he died. Renee's attorney, Philip Wren, called Andrew the following Wednesday morning. Andrew relayed the conversation to me in a voice note that afternoon. Philip had laid out Renee's position clearly. The November 2023 will was valid. Renee was the sole beneficiary, and she expected full and immediate transfer of all estate assets, including Whitfield General Contractors LLC. Philip made pointed reference to the fact that any attempt to contest the will or introduce alternative asset structures would be met with aggressive litigation. He used the phrase scorched earth at least twice, Andrew said, which was interesting coming from a man who was about to walk into a fire. Andrew's response, delivered with the measured calm of a man who has won things in rooms most people will never enter, was simple. Nathaniel Whitfield did not intend to contest the will. He would comply with the terms of the November 2023 will in full. All LLC interests would be transferred to Renee Whitfield as specified. Andrew would prepare the paperwork. There was a pause on Philip's end of that call. That's reasonable, Philip had said, clearly expecting a fight and now slightly wrong-footed by the absence of one. Nathaniel is a reasonable person, Andrew had replied. He just wants his father's wishes respected. I want to pause here and tell you something about how grief and clarity can coexist in the same body at the same time, because most people think they're opposites. They're not. I was genuinely, deeply sad about losing my father. I missed him in a way I hadn't been prepared for. the silence where a phone call used to be, the automatic reflex of wanting to call him when something happened at work. Grief is not convenient. It doesn't wait for business hours. But grief also has a way of clarifying what matters. And what mattered, standing in the cold, clear light of March 2024 in Phoenix, was that my father had prepared something. He had anticipated this. He had done the work. The least I could do was honor it by doing mine. During the weeks between the funeral and the hearing, I kept going into the office. Whitfield General's operations manager, a 43-year-old man named Marcus Boyd, who had been with the company for 11 years, knew about the restructuring. He'd been briefed by my father and by Andrew. Marcus ran the daily operations with the steady, unsentimental competence of a man who understood that projects don't pause for personal drama. The workforce knew something was happening. A business transition after the owner's death is impossible to hide. But nobody panicked, because the paychecks kept clearing and the job sites kept running. That was by design. The holding entity structure meant operations were fully insulated from the estate proceedings. Renee, as far as I knew, had no idea any of this was in motion. I did have one direct interaction with her during this period, a Wednesday afternoon in late March when she called me on the phone. I was in my truck parked outside a job site in Mesa, eating a sandwich and reviewing plans. Nathaniel. Her voice was measured, friendly. Even the hotel concierge voice turned up a few degrees. I just want you to know I don't want this to be adversarial. Your father loved you. I know that. I'd like us to be able to move forward with some level of mutual respect. Mutual respect. The woman who had emailed me 48 hours after the funeral through an attorney. I think that's a reasonable goal, I said, matching her tone exactly. Philip tells me your lawyer has agreed to the transfer. I appreciate that, Nathaniel. Truly. My father's wishes were clear. I'm not going to stand in the way of that. A pause. Something shifted in the silence. I could almost feel her recalibrating, reassessing whether I was naive or resigned. I think we can still have a relationship, she said finally. As family. Of course, I said. I finished my sandwich after she hung up. The sun was hammering the asphalt outside the job site, and the air smelled like concrete and machine exhaust. The smell of my whole childhood. The smell of my father's hands. I thought about what she had said. As family. I didn't know yet that in 4 days she would never use that word with me again. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning in early April 2024. Maricopa County Superior Court, downtown Phoenix. Andrew had filed the paperwork for the voluntary transfer of LLC interests. Clean, uncontested, exactly what Renee's attorney had demanded. No fight, no opposition, just execution of the will as written. I wore a gray blazer and dark jeans, the kind of thing my dad would have called dressed enough. I drove downtown, parked in the garage on Washington Street, and walked the 2 blocks to the courthouse with the sun already warm on the back of my neck at 8:15 in the morning. Andrew was waiting in the hallway outside the hearing room. Beside him was his associate, a woman named Paula Nguyen, who managed complex trust documentation and who had been, Andrew said, the architect of the holding entity structure. She was quiet, thorough, and had the expression of someone who had already run every scenario and was not concerned. Renee arrived with Philip Wren at 8:40. She was dressed sharply, black blazer, pearl earrings, the full presentation of a woman who expected to be confirmed in possession of something significant. Philip was a tall man in his late 50s, silver-haired and competent-looking in the way that expensive attorneys are trained to appear. He greeted Andrew with a professional nod and set his briefcase on the table. We all sat down. The proceeding was administrative in nature. No jury, no dramatic courtroom, just a judge, a court officer, and the transfer of an estate. The judge reviewed the filings. She confirmed the November 2023 will's validity. She confirmed that Nathaniel Allen Whitfield had consented to the transfer of all LLC interests to Renee Whitfield without contest. She asked Andrew directly whether his client had any objections. None, Your Honor, Andrew said. Mr. Whitfield is in full agreement with the transfer as documented. Renee sat back slightly in her chair. I watched Philip's posture relax, the set of his shoulders dropping maybe a half-inch, the tell of a litigator who came prepared for a war and is quietly relieved there won't be one. The judge approved the transfer. She signed the order. That was the moment Philip reached for the business asset schedule, the supporting documentation that itemized exactly what Whitfield General Contractors LLC contained. Documentation that, under court procedure, he was required to review for the record before the transfer was formally closed. He opened the folder. He read the first page. He turned to the second page. He stopped. I watched his face change the way a structure changes when a load-bearing element fails. Not all at once, but progressively, as his brain processed what his eyes were reading and refused for a moment to accept the calculation. He looked up at Andrew. Andrew looked back at him, entirely calm, entirely still. The way a man looks when he already knows every word on every page. Philip looked back down at the document. He read the line again, the one specific sentence that had stopped him cold. The sentence that described the current asset value of Whitfield General Contractors LLC as of the date of transfer, following the October 2023 restructuring into the Walter H. Whitfield Family Trust. Net asset value, $0. The silence in that hearing room lasted about 4 seconds. In a courtroom, 4 seconds is a very long time. Philip Wren set the document down on the table with the deliberate care of a man trying to keep his hands steady. He removed his reading glasses, folded them, placed them beside the document. He looked at Andrew Kessler with an expression that was trying very hard to remain professional and was losing the battle by small, visible degrees. "Counsel," he said, "I'd like to request a brief recess." The judge granted it. Renee leaned toward Philip immediately, her voice low, but not low enough. "What's wrong? What does it say?" "Renee." Philip's voice was a wall. "Not here." They stepped into the hallway. I stayed in my seat. Andrew poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on the table, unhurried, and slid one across to me. "How are you doing?" he asked quietly. "I'm good," I said. And I meant it. Through the glass panel beside the hearing room door, I could see Renee's face changing. The composed widow's mask, the one she had been wearing since the funeral, since the email, since the phone call about moving forward as family, was coming off in real time. I watched Philip speak, watched him show her the document, watched her head tilt forward to read it, then come back up. Her expression went through 3 or 4 distinct phases in about 30 seconds. I recognized all of them. Confusion. Then disbelief. Then the specific, sharp-jawed fury of a person who realizes they have been outmaneuvered. She pushed back into the hearing room before Philip could stop her. "What did you do?" She was looking at me. Her voice was controlled, but only barely. "What did you do to that company?" I looked at her calmly. "I didn't do anything to the company, Renee. My father did, 18 months ago. That's fraud. That's illegal. He stripped the assets from the estate. He restructured his business," Andrew said, smoothly and without emphasis, which is a legal right of any business owner. The restructuring was completed in October 2023, fully documented with a clear and auditable business rationale. The will your client is relying on was executed in November 2023, after the restructuring was complete. Mr. Whitfield was entirely within his legal rights. He did this to cut me out. He did this to protect his business, Andrew said. Whether you view those as the same thing is a matter of perspective. Philip had come back in and had his hand lightly on Renee's arm, the practiced, careful gesture of an attorney managing a client who was about to say something unhelpful. "Renee, please." She sat down. She was breathing in the measured way people breathe when they are trying to prevent themselves from screaming. The judge returned. The proceedings resumed. The transfer of Whitfield General Contractors LLC, the empty shell, the zero-asset entity, the name and nothing else, was formally completed. Renee Whitfield received exactly what my father's November 2023 will specified. The company, 100% of the shares. She inherited a clean corporate filing with no employees, no contracts, no equipment, no property, and no receivables. She inherited the letterhead. I didn't say anything triumphant. I didn't want to. This was never about victory. It was about completion. My father had set the table. I just had to show up and not knock anything over. After the hearing, in the parking garage on Washington Street, Andrew walked with me to my truck. The April sun was already aggressive, bouncing white off the concrete walls. "She'll instruct Philip to challenge the restructuring," Andrew said. "He'll file within 30 days. Can he? He can file. Winning is a different question. Arizona recognizes a surviving spouse's right to an elective share of the augmented estate, 33% under Arizona's elective share statute. But the augmented estate calculation has to account for the fair market value of assets transferred within 2 years, and the documented business rationale we have on the restructuring is going to make the fraudulent transfer argument very hard to sustain. We have the discrepancy records your father compiled. We have the vendor audit. We have a clear paper trail." I nodded. What does she actually end up with if they pursue the elective share? Realistically, the family residence, which is fully paid off, worth approximately $1 million in today's Phoenix market. The personal financial accounts Walter held, which total somewhere in the range of $400,000 after estate costs. A legitimate claim to a portion of the marital portion of business goodwill, which we will argue down hard. She ends up comfortable, Nathaniel. She's not destitute. I'm not trying to destroy her, I said. I just wasn't going to let her take what 110 people depend on. Andrew nodded slowly. Your father said almost exactly the same words to me when he came in that September. I sat with that for a second. He had been watching the same thing I was watching. The slow, systematic positioning, the accounts, the cordial indifference, the patient accumulation of proximity to something valuable. He had just been quieter about it than I would have been, and more methodical, and more thorough. He had done what he always did. He had built something to last. Over the following weeks, Philip filed the elective share claim exactly as Andrew had predicted. The litigation was real. Months of depositions, document productions, financial forensics. Renee hired a forensic accountant. We hired a better one. What the forensic accounting revealed, once Renee's team had gone digging in the hope of finding grounds to challenge the restructuring, was not what they were looking for. It was something much worse for her. The same vendor invoices I had flagged to my father in October 2021. The ones that had led him quietly to compile his own documentation, became relevant in the discovery process. A pattern emerged across 14 months of company records. Inflated vendor invoices from a sole proprietorship that had no verifiable physical address, the payments from which traced back through a single-member LLC registered in Nevada to an account with Renee Whitfield as signatory. $263,000 over 14 months. Andrew didn't bring it to Philip as a threat. He filed it with the court as part of the elective share proceeding, as relevant financial history affecting the augmented estate calculation, specifically as a reduction to the estate value traceable to transfers the court might choose to characterize as misconduct. Philip Wren withdrew from the case 11 days later. He cited a conflict of interest in his withdrawal filing, which is the polite legal language for "I am not going to be in the room when this gets worse." Renee retained a new attorney, a younger woman named Laura Bennett, out of Tempe. Laura was sharp, and she understood immediately that her client's negotiating position had collapsed. Within 3 weeks, Laura called Andrew with a settlement proposal. Renee would drop all elective share claims. She would accept the family residence and the personal accounts. She would sign a full release of any interest in the holding entity, the trust, and the operations of Whitfield General Contractors. In exchange, the financial misconduct documentation would be treated as settled and not referred to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. Andrew brought it to me on a Tuesday evening. We sat in his office with the city lights coming on outside the windows and the traffic on Central Avenue thinning out below us. "It's a clean resolution," Andrew said. "She walks away with assets. You walk away without a criminal referral process that could take years. Does she deserve that?" I asked. Andrew looked at me steadily. "Deserve is a theological question, Nathaniel. I'm a lawyer. What I can tell you is that this settlement protects the company, protects the employees, and closes this chapter cleanly. Your father didn't structure this to punish Renee. He structured it to protect the business. He was right, and I knew it. I signed the settlement agreement on a Wednesday morning in May 2024, 14 weeks after my father's funeral. 11 weeks after a lawyer had sat in a Maricopa County courtroom and read a single line that changed every assumption he had walked in with. I drove out to the North Phoenix job site after I signed, a commercial warehouse project in the Deer Valley area that Marcus Boyd had been managing through all of it. The concrete already poured and the steel going up on schedule, because that is what this company does. I parked the truck and walked the perimeter. The steel workers were running beams 40 feet up. The sun was doing that particular Phoenix thing where it turns the whole horizon into hammered copper in the late afternoon. I called Marcus on the radio. "How's the pour looking?" "Clean," Marcus said. "North elevation is exactly where we want it." "Good. Keep it rolling." I stood there for a while, listening to the machinery and the metal and the ordinary, irreplaceable sound of something being built. My father had stood on 100 job sites exactly like this one. Different cities, different decades, the same sound. The sound of something that lasts. I didn't need the moment to be cinematic. It was already everything. The last thing I want to say about all of this is something that took me months to understand, and I want to say it clearly, because this channel is about more than the drama. It's about what the drama teaches. My father was 67 years old when he died. In the last 18 months of his life, while managing a cardiac condition, while slowing down, while grieving in his quiet way, he had the clarity and the discipline to document, restructure, consult his attorney, and protect a business that 110 families depended on. He didn't do it out of rage. He didn't do it for revenge. He did it because he was a builder. And builders think about what happens after they're gone. I had spent years being careful not to be adversarial. Careful not to create conflict in my father's marriage. Careful to be the cooperative adult stepchild who didn't make things difficult. And I understand why. I wanted to protect my relationship with my dad. But that careful neutrality had also allowed a situation to develop, financially, relationally, structurally, that required emergency intervention. The lesson I carry from this is not that you should be suspicious of everyone who marries into your family. The lesson is that love and due diligence are not opposites. You can love a person and still read the contract. You can respect a relationship and still verify the accounts. You can be loyal to your family and still know exactly what you own and what the paperwork says. My father knew. He just acted on that knowledge a little later than ideal. And when he did, he was thorough, he was careful. And he left me with something I could work with. That's the inheritance that actually mattered. The business is operating. The employees are working. The projects are on schedule. And every single morning, I make scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and black coffee. No butter, just heat and patience. That's how you build something that lasts.